I pray that whatever broke you this week begins to gently heal, that the storm inside you finally quiets, that love comes back, not loud, but steady, in the way someone sees you or speaks softly to your soul. I pray your tears have purpose, your pain finds peace, and that even in the silence, you feel held by something greater than fear. You're not just cared for, you are treasured, deeply, endlessly, always. Now, please hear this. Yesterday I asked YouTube why my channel is dropping. Their answer crushed me. They said, "Your loyal viewers now skip your videos. They don't engage like before." I whispered, "That can't be true. They're my family." But they said, "You need to believe it." And I broke. Because I still believe in you, in us. I'm showing up here through heart pain, through quiet tears, through moments I almost gave up, but I stayed for love, for you. So if you still feel me, please like this video, drop a comment, share it. It takes seconds, but it could save this family from fading. And most of all, don't leave the story in the middle. Every second is a piece of me I wrote for you. When you leave early, I feel it, deeply. This isn't just a video. It's a home, built with love. Ours. Forever your Mr. Peter, with more love than words can hold. The baby was dying, and Gareth Hobson couldn't bring himself to care. He stood in the shadows of the marble foyer, watching yet another nurse hurry up the grand staircase with her bag of useless remedies, her face tight with professional determination. 9 months. 9 months of watching his daughter slowly fade away, rejecting every bottle, every formula, every wet nurse the finest agencies could provide. 9 months of living in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. November rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Connecticut estate, each drop echoing the hollow rhythm of his heart. Gareth pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his grey eyes fixed on the ornate chandelier that had once illuminated his wife's laughter. Now it cast long shadows across empty rooms where Charlotte's cries barely registered as more than background noise to his grief. "Mr. Hobson." The voice belonged to Eleanor Harrington, his head housekeeper, whose weathered face had grown more lined with each passing month. "The new nurse from the Whitmore agency has arrived." Gareth didn't move. The last nurse had lasted 3 days before Charlotte's relentless rejection broke her spirit. The one before that had quit after a single night, claiming the baby was inconsolable and beyond help. As if he didn't already know his daughter was slipping away from him, one refused feeding at a time. "Sir?" Eleanor's voice carried the gentle insistence of someone who'd spent 40 years managing the Hobson household. "Dr. Whitmore specifically requested this nurse. Says she's different." Different. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. They'd tried different. They'd tried everything. Pediatric specialists from Johns Hopkins, nutritionists from Boston Children's, even a lactation consultant from Switzerland who'd cost him more than most people made in a year. Nothing worked. Nothing helped. Charlotte continued to grow weaker, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching as she fought against every attempt to nourish her. "Show her up," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse. He hadn't spoken to anyone except Eleanor and his business partner Theodore in weeks. The board meetings for Hobson Steel were conducted via video conference now, his empire running on autopilot while he haunted the halls of his own home. Eleanor nodded and disappeared toward the front door, leaving Gareth alone with his demons. He closed his eyes and saw Catherine's face, radiant with joy even as the life drained from her eyes. "Take care of our baby," she'd whispered, her hand growing cold in his. "Promise me, Gareth. Promise me you'll love her enough for both of us." He'd failed. God help him. He'd failed completely. The sound of footsteps on marble drew his attention back to the present. Eleanor was returning, accompanied by a woman who moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to crisis. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 30, with rich brown skin and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she carried herself with the kind of professional grace that spoke of countless hours in pediatric wards. "Mr. Hobson," Eleanor said, "this is Sabrina Fisher from the Whitmore Agency." Sabrina stepped forward, and Gareth was struck by the steadiness of her gaze. She didn't look at him with the mixture of pity and discomfort he'd grown accustomed to seeing in everyone's eyes. Instead, she studied him with the clinical assessment of someone who'd seen desperate parents before. "Mr. Hobson," she said, her voice warm but professional, "I understand Charlotte has been having feeding difficulties." "Difficulties?" The word came out harsher than he intended. "That's one way to put it." Sabrina didn't flinch. "I'd like to examine her if I may. Dr. Whitmore has briefed me on her medical history, but I prefer to make my own assessment." "Of course you do." Gareth pushed away from the wall, his movements sharp with barely contained frustration. "They all do. They all think they're the one who's going to save her." "I'm not here to save anyone, Mr. Hobson," Sabrina said quietly. "I'm here to help your daughter eat. Nothing more, nothing less." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. There was no false hope in her expression, no hollow reassurances. Just a quiet determination that felt different from the others, more real somehow. "She's upstairs," he said finally. "Third door on the right." Sabrina nodded and started toward the staircase, her footsteps sure and purposeful. Gareth found himself following, drawn by something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the way she moved, without the nervous energy of someone trying to prove herself. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't offered him any empty platitudes about everything being all right. The nursery was a study in contrasts. Catherine had decorated it in soft pastels and hand-painted murals, every detail chosen with love and hope. Now it felt like a shrine to dreams that would never come true. The expensive baby monitor sat silent on the dresser, its green light blinking steadily. The rocking chair Catherine had picked out sat empty in the corner, its cushions still bearing the faint scent of her perfume. Charlotte lay in her crib, tiny and fragile, her breathing shallow and rapid. At 9 months, she should have been babbling and pulling herself up, reaching for toys and exploring her world. Instead, she was listless, her enormous blue eyes tracking movement with the desperate hunger of someone who wanted to live, but didn't know how. Sabrina approached the crib with the careful movements of someone who understood that every moment mattered. She didn't speak, didn't make the cooing sounds that usually accompanied interactions with babies. Instead, she simply observed, her trained eye taking in Charlotte's color, her breathing, the way she held her small hands. "When did she last accept any nutrition?" Sabrina asked, her fingers gently stroking Charlotte's forehead. "Yesterday morning," Gareth said. 2 ounces of formula before she refused the rest. And before that, the day before, maybe 3 ounces. Sabrina's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Hobson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "What?" "Are you prepared to do whatever it takes to save your daughter's life?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What kind of question is that? The kind that needs an answer. Sabrina's eyes met his, and he saw steel beneath the compassion. "Because if you're not, I need to know now. I don't waste time on parents who aren't fully committed to their child's survival." Gareth felt something crack inside his chest. "She's all I have left." "Then we need to act fast." Sabrina was already moving, her hands gentle but efficient as she lifted Charlotte from the crib. I'm going to try something different, something that might seem unconventional. What do you mean? But Sabrina was already settling into the rocking chair, Charlotte cradled against her chest. The baby's cries, weak but persistent, filled the room as she began to root against Sabrina's scrubs with the desperate instinct of survival. "Mr. Hobson," Sabrina said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to do is purely medical, therapeutic. Your daughter is starving, and her body is rejecting artificial nutrition. Sometimes, when all else fails, we have to go back to the most basic form of sustenance." Gareth watched in stunned silence as Sabrina began to unbutton her uniform top. The clinical nature of her movements couldn't disguise the intimacy of the act, the profound trust required to nourish another woman's child with her own body. "I've been working with failure-to-thrive infants for 8 years, Sabrina continued, her voice soft but confident. "I've seen cases like Charlotte's before. Sometimes the only thing that can save them is human breast milk from someone who's willing to take the risk." "Risk?" Gareth's voice came out as a croak. "The risk of caring too much," Sabrina said simply, "of letting myself become attached to a child who might not make it." Charlotte's cries quieted as Sabrina guided her to her breast. The baby latched instinctively, her tiny fists relaxing for the first time in days as she finally found the nourishment her body craved. The sound of her contented sucking filled the room, a sound Gareth hadn't heard since Catherine's death. He should have looked away, should have given them privacy, but he found himself frozen in place, watching this stranger save his daughter's life with an act of such profound generosity that it took his breath away. In the soft glow of the nursery lamp, Sabrina looked like a Madonna, her face serene and focused as she gave Charlotte what no amount of money could buy. "She's eating," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "Yes," Sabrina said, her eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. "She's eating." For the first time in 9 months, Gareth Hobson felt something other than despair. It was fragile, this flicker of hope, but it was real. And as he watched his daughter's color slowly return to normal, as her breathing deepened and her tiny body relaxed into the rhythm of life, he realized that everything was about to change. The woman in the rocking chair had just saved his daughter's life, but as he stood there in the shadows, watching her nurse his child with such tender care, Gareth couldn't shake the feeling that she might just save his life too. The storm outside began to quiet, and for the first time since Catherine's death, the house felt like a home again. Chapter 2. Fortress of Steel and Sorrow. The empire that had made Gareth Hobson one of the most powerful men in America was built on steel, but the man himself had become something far harder and more unforgiving. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan office 48 hours after Sabrina Fisher had saved his daughter's life, watching the city spread out below him like a chessboard where he'd learned to play God with other people's livelihoods. The Hobson Steel building rose 60 floors above the financial district, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun in blinding flashes that matched the cold fire burning within him. "The quarterly reports are on your desk," Theodore Fairchild said from behind him, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate his best friend's grief. "The Pittsburgh mill is exceeding projections by 12%. Gareth didn't turn around. Couldn't turn around. Because if he looked at Ted's face, he'd see the same mixture of relief and concern that had been there since the phone call. The call where Gareth had told him, in a voice rough with wonder, that Charlotte was eating, that she was going to live. "Cancel the Hartford meeting," Gareth said instead, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I'm going home." "Home?" Ted's surprise was obvious. "Gareth, You haven't left the office before 8 o'clock in 9 months. The board is expecting. The board can wait. Gareth's voice carried the steel that had built his empire, the ruthless edge that had crushed competitors and forged alliances. I have more important things to do. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things Ted wanted to say, but didn't dare. They'd been friends since Harvard, business partners for 15 years, and Ted had watched Gareth transform from a driven but caring man into something harder after Catherine's death. The grief had crystallized into a kind of armor, protecting him from feeling anything at all. "She's really getting better?" Ted asked finally, his voice soft with the hope he'd been afraid to voice. "She's eating." The words came out rough, like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside. "Every 3 hours, like clockwork. The nurse says she's gaining weight." "That's wonderful, Gareth. Catherine would be—" "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't bring her into this." Ted fell silent, but Gareth could feel his friend's eyes on him, could sense the questions he wanted to ask, about the nurse, about what had changed, about why Gareth was suddenly racing home to Connecticut instead of burying himself in work the way he had for the past 9 months. The truth was, Gareth didn't know how to answer those questions. He only knew that something had shifted the moment he'd watched Sabrina Fisher cradle his daughter, her dark eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness that had awakened something he'd thought was dead. For 48 hours, he'd tried to focus on earnings reports and merger negotiations, but his mind kept drifting back to that rocking chair, to the sound of Charlotte's contented sighs, to the way Sabrina had looked at him without pity or judgment. "I'll be working from home for the next few days," he said finally. "Handle anything urgent." Ted nodded, though Gareth could see his reflection in the window, could see the worry etched in his friend's features. "Should I tell Margaret you won't be at dinner Friday?" Margaret Whitmore had been trying to set him up with suitable women for months, well-meaning attempts to pull him back into the world of the living. Elegant widows from their social circle, accomplished businesswomen who understood the demands of his world, women who looked at him and saw dollar signs and status symbols instead of the broken man he'd become. "Tell her I'm unavailable," Gareth said, already reaching for his jacket. "Indefinitely." The drive to Connecticut usually took an hour and a half, but Gareth made it in just over an hour, his silver Aston Martin eating up the miles with predatory efficiency. He'd been avoiding the house, spending most nights in his Manhattan penthouse rather than facing the memories that lurked in every room. But now, for the first time in months, he felt pulled toward home. The Hobson estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, its Georgian architecture and manicured gardens a testament to old money and older traditions. Gareth's grandfather had built the original house in the 1920s, and each generation had added their own touches. Catherine had been planning a renovation of the East Wing when she'd gotten pregnant, dreaming of filling the rooms with children's laughter. Now those rooms stood empty, their windows dark, while life centered around the nursery where his daughter was slowly learning to live again. Eleanor met him at the front door, her face brightening in a way that made him realize how long it had been since he'd come home before midnight. "Mr. Hobson," she said, taking his coat with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing the household since he was a boy. "Miss Fisher is upstairs with Charlotte. They're having quite a good day." "How good?" He tried to keep the hunger out of his voice, but Eleanor's knowing smile told him he'd failed. "She took 4 ounces this morning and 5 at lunch. Miss Fisher says she's already looking stronger." Gareth nodded, but his feet were already carrying him toward the staircase. He took the steps 2 at a time, driven by something he couldn't name. Need, maybe, or hope, or the desperate desire to see proof that his daughter was really going to survive. The nursery door was slightly open, and he paused on the threshold, his breath catching at the scene inside. Sabrina was sitting in the rocking chair, Charlotte cradled in her arms, but she wasn't feeding her. Instead, she was talking to her, her voice soft and musical as she described the world outside the window. "Do you see those leaves, sweet girl? They're turning gold and red because autumn is here. Soon they'll fall, and then winter will come with snow so white it looks like diamonds. And after that, spring will return with flowers and green grass and butterflies." Charlotte was staring up at her with wide, alert eyes, more focused than Gareth had seen her since birth. Her tiny fist was wrapped around Sabrina's finger, and she seemed to be listening to every word, with the intensity of someone learning what it meant to be alive. "She's beautiful," Sabrina murmured, her thumb stroking Charlotte's cheek. "So beautiful and so strong. Your mama would be so proud of you, fighting so hard to stay with us." The words hit Gareth like a physical blow. Catherine, the woman who'd planned to nurse their daughter herself, who'd read every book on infant care, who'd died before she could hold her baby for more than a few precious minutes. "Don't." The word came out harsh, echoing in the quiet room. Sabrina's head snapped up, her eyes finding his in the doorway. She didn't look startled or guilty, just steady, like she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Hobson," she said quietly, "I didn't hear you come in." "I said don't." He stepped into the room, his movements sharp with the anger that had become his default emotion. "Don't talk to her about Catherine. Don't pretend you knew her." Sabrina's expression didn't change. "I wasn't pretending anything. I was telling Charlotte about her mother because children need to know where they come from, even when they're too young to understand the words." "She doesn't need to know about Catherine." The words tasted like poison. "Catherine is dead." "Charlotte's mother is dead," Sabrina corrected gently. "But that doesn't mean she never existed. It doesn't mean she didn't love this baby with everything she had." Gareth felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd built around his heart. "You don't know anything about Catherine. I know she decorated this nursery with her own hands." Sabrina's voice was soft but unwavering. "I know she chose that mobile because she thought Charlotte would like the way the stars moved. I know she picked out that rocking chair because she wanted to sit here and nurse her daughter while watching the sunset through those windows." "Stop." The word came out broken. "I know she died trying to bring Charlotte into the world, and I know she would want her daughter to thrive, not just survive." Gareth's hands clenched into fists. "You know nothing. Nothing about her. Nothing about us. Nothing about what we lost." Sabrina stood slowly, Charlotte still cradled in her arms, and for a moment Gareth thought she was going to back down. Instead, she moved closer, her dark eyes blazing with something that might have been anger or determination or both. "I know you're so afraid of losing Charlotte that you've already given up on her," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I know you've been hiding from your own daughter because looking at her reminds you of what you lost instead of what you still have. How dare you!" "I know you haven't held her in weeks." Sabrina's words cut through his protest like a blade. "I know you pay other people to care for her because you're too terrified to let yourself love her." The accusation hung in the air between them, stark and terrible in its truth. Gareth felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to tremble, felt the grief and fear and desperate love he'd been suppressing threaten to break free. "She's better off without me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone I love dies." "That's not how love works," Sabrina said simply. "Love doesn't die when people do. It just changes form. And this little girl needs her father's love, not his fear." She was standing close enough now that he could smell her perfume, something light and clean that mixed with the baby powder and warmth that seemed to surround her. Charlotte was looking up at both of them with those enormous blue eyes, and for a moment Gareth saw Catherine in her face. Not the pale, dying woman from his nightmares, but the vibrant, laughing woman who'd married him in the garden of this very house. "She looks like her," he said, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. "She looks like you too," Sabrina said gently. "She has your chin, your stubborn streak, from what I can tell." Despite everything, Gareth felt his mouth twitch in what might have been a smile. "Catherine always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "Smart woman." Sabrina's voice was warm with approval. "She'd want you to be stubborn about loving Charlotte, stubborn about fighting for her, stubborn about not giving up." The baby chose that moment to let out a soft cry, and Sabrina immediately shifted her attention, her voice dropping to that musical croon that seemed to calm Charlotte instantly. Watching her, Gareth felt something shift inside him, some fundamental realignment of his understanding of the world. This woman had saved his daughter's life, not with medical equipment or expensive procedures, but with the simple, profound act of giving her own body to nourish a child that wasn't hers. She'd asked for nothing in return, expected nothing, and now she was trying to save him too. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why are you doing this?" Sabrina looked up at him, her expression serious. "Because she deserves to live. Because she deserves to be loved. Because sometimes the only way to heal from loss is to save someone else from losing everything too." The words hit him like a revelation, and Gareth realized that she wasn't just talking about Charlotte. She was talking about both of them, about the strange alchemy that happened when two broken people found a way to piece each other back together. "I don't know how to be her father," he admitted, the words coming out in a rush. "I don't know how to love her without thinking about Catherine. I don't know how to look at her without seeing everything I failed to protect." "You learn," Sabrina said simply. "One day at a time. One feeding at a time, one moment at a time." She held out Charlotte to him, and for the first time in months, Gareth didn't flinch away. Instead, he reached out with trembling hands and took his daughter into his arms. She was so small, so warm, so perfectly alive that it took his breath away. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here." Charlotte blinked up at him, and for a moment Gareth could have sworn she smiled. It was probably just gas or a random facial expression, but it felt like forgiveness, like Catherine herself was telling him it was okay to love again. Standing there in the nursery where his wife had planned to raise their child, holding his daughter while the woman who'd saved them both watched with tears in her eyes, Gareth Hobson felt the first crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. It was terrifying and wonderful and absolutely inevitable. The healing had begun. Chapter 3. The Tender Rebellion. The walls of the Hobson estate had witnessed over a century of secrets, but none as dangerous as the one growing between the grieving billionaire and the woman who'd saved his daughter's life. Sabrina Fisher had been living in the mansion for a week now, and the change in Charlotte was nothing short of miraculous. The baby who'd been slowly fading away was now thriving, her cheeks pink with health, her eyes bright with curiosity. She'd gained precious ounces that translated to years of life, and her contented sighs during feeding time had become the soundtrack to a house learning to live again. But it was the change in Gareth Hobson that kept Sabrina awake at night. "She's getting stronger," Dr. Margaret Whitmore said, her stethoscope sliding over Charlotte's chest as she conducted the weekly examination. "Her heart rate is excellent, her reflexes are normal, and she's gained 8 ounces since you arrived." Sabrina nodded, cradling Charlotte against her chest as the baby dozed peacefully. They were in the nursery, afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows that Catherine Hobson had chosen for their perfect view of the garden. The room smelled of baby powder and the faint scent of roses from the arrangements Eleanor refreshed daily. "The feeding schedule is working well," Sabrina said, though her eyes drifted to the doorway where Gareth had been appearing with increasing frequency. "She's taking to the routine beautifully." "And how are you holding up?" Margaret's question was gentle but probing. "This kind of arrangement can be emotionally taxing. You're essentially mothering a child who isn't yours." The words hit closer to home than Sabrina cared to admit. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 8 years, had worked with hundreds of sick children, but she'd never lived with one. Never woken up at 2 in the morning to comfort a crying baby. Never felt the overwhelming protectiveness that came with being someone's primary caregiver. And she definitely never felt the confusing tangle of emotions that came with watching Charlotte's father slowly emerge from his grief-induced exile. "I'm fine," she said, though the lie felt heavy on her tongue. "Charlotte is my only concern." Margaret's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Gareth's arrival. He appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business suit from the morning's video conferences, his tie loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled. "How is she?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he'd adopted since that emotional moment a week ago when he'd held Charlotte for the first time in months. "Perfect," Margaret said warmly. "Absolutely perfect. You have a very healthy little girl, Gareth." Something flickered in his eyes at the words. Relief, pride, maybe even joy, but it was gone so quickly Sabrina wondered if she'd imagined it. He'd been doing that all week, allowing himself moments of connection with Charlotte before retreating behind the walls he'd built around his heart. "I should let you get back to work," Margaret said, packing her medical bag efficiently. "But I want to see her again next week. And Sabrina—" She paused, her expression serious. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call me. Day or night." There was something in her tone that made Sabrina wonder what the older woman suspected, but she simply nodded and watched as Margaret left, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. "She's worried about you," Gareth said quietly, moving into the room with the careful steps of someone trying not to disturb the peace. "She's a good doctor," Sabrina replied, which wasn't really an answer. "She's also a good friend. She's been trying to take care of me since Catherine died." He was standing by the window now, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "She thinks I'm damaged goods." "Are you?" The question slipped out before Sabrina could stop it, and she immediately regretted the boldness. This wasn't her place. She was here to care for Charlotte, not to psychoanalyze her employer. But Gareth turned to look at her, and there was something raw in his expression that made her breath catch. Probably. The honesty in his voice made her heart ache. She'd been watching him all week, seeing the way he hovered in doorways, the way he'd reach toward Charlotte before pulling back, the way he'd catch himself smiling before remembering he wasn't supposed to be happy. "Charlotte doesn't think so," she said softly. "She lights up when she hears your voice. She's too young to know better. Or maybe she's too young to be fooled by the act you put on for everyone else." The words hung in the air between them, and Sabrina immediately wanted to take them back. She was overstepping, crossing lines that had been clearly drawn when she'd accepted this position. But she couldn't stand watching him punish himself for surviving when his wife hadn't. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That was inappropriate." "Was it?" Gareth moved closer, his grey eyes intense. "Or was it the first honest thing anyone said to me in months?" Charlotte stirred in her arms, making the soft mewling sounds that meant she was waking up. Sabrina automatically began the gentle swaying motion that usually soothed her, but the baby's eyes opened and immediately found her father's face. "Hey, sweetheart," Gareth said automatically, his voice dropping to that tender tone he seemed to reserve for Charlotte. Did you have a good nap? Charlotte's response was a gurgling sound that might have been a laugh, and Sabrina watched as Gareth's carefully constructed mask slipped for just a moment. The love in his eyes was so intense it was almost painful to witness. "She wants you to hold her," Sabrina said, though she wasn't sure if it was true, or if she just wanted to see that look in his eyes again. "I don't want to disturb her routine." "Her routine includes being held by her father." Sabrina stood, moving toward him with Charlotte in her arms. "She needs to know you're real, not just a voice in the doorway." For a moment she thought he was going to refuse. His whole body had gone tense, and she could see the war playing out in his expression. But then Charlotte made another soft sound, and his resolve crumbled. "Okay," he said quietly. "But if she cries, she won't cry." Sabrina placed Charlotte in his arms, her hands briefly covering his to help him support the baby's head. The contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her, and she quickly stepped back, but not before she saw the wonder in Gareth's eyes as Charlotte settled against his chest, her tiny fist curling around his finger with the absolute trust that only babies possessed. "She's so small," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I keep forgetting how small she is." "She's perfect," Sabrina said, though she was watching him more than the baby. "And she's yours." The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Catherine should be here. She should be the one holding her, feeding her, singing to her. But she's not. Sabrina's voice was gentle but firm. And Charlotte can't wait for her mother to come back. She needs the parent she has, not the one she lost. What if I'm not enough? The question came out broken, and Sabrina realized this was the fear that had been eating at him all along. Not just the fear of losing Charlotte, but the fear of failing her. "You're her father," she said simply. "That's enough. That's everything." Charlotte chose that moment to let out a soft sigh, snuggling deeper into Gareth's embrace. He looked down at her with such overwhelming love that Sabrina had to look away, her heart clenching with something that felt dangerously close to longing. "I used to come in here every night," he said quietly. "After Catherine died, I'd stand by her crib and watch her sleep, and I'd try to feel something other than this crushing weight in my chest." "And now?" Sabrina asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Now I'm terrified that I'm going to love her too much and lose her too." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest and devastating. Sabrina felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't about her feelings. This was about a man learning to be a father while drowning in grief. "Love doesn't make loss more likely," she said finally. "It just makes it more meaningful." Gareth looked up at her, and for a moment, the careful distance he'd been maintaining crumbled completely. She could see everything in his eyes, the grief, the fear, the desperate need to connect with another human being who understood what it meant to love something more than your own life. "How do you know?" he asked. "How do you know any of this?" The question was loaded with more than curiosity, and Sabrina felt her carefully constructed professional boundaries beginning to blur. She'd been so focused on Charlotte's needs that she'd forgotten about her own vulnerability, about the way this man's pain called to something deep inside her. "Because I've seen what happens when people stop loving," she said carefully. "And it's not protection. It's just another kind of death." The words were truer than she'd intended, and she saw recognition flicker in Gareth's eyes. He was starting to see her as more than just Charlotte's caregiver, and that was dangerous for both of them. "You should probably put her down for her nap," Sabrina said, stepping back and trying to recreate the professional distance that had been keeping them safe. "She's had a lot of stimulation today." But Gareth wasn't ready to let the moment go. "Sabrina," he said, her name sounding different in his voice, warmer, more personal. I want to thank you for everything you've done, for saving her life. You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job. No, he said firmly. You weren't. You went above and beyond anything that could be expected, and He paused, struggling with words that seemed too big for the space between them. I don't know how to repay you. You don't repay me, Sabrina said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. You love your daughter. You show up for her. You let yourself be happy that she's alive. And what about you? The question was quiet, but it carried a weight that made her stomach flip. What do you need? The answer came to her immediately, unbidden and terrifying. I need you to stop looking at me like I'm saving your life along with hers. I need you to stop making me feel like I'm the missing piece in your broken family. I need you to stop making me wish I could stay forever. I need to do my job, she said instead, her voice carefully neutral. Charlotte needs her afternoon feeding soon. Something flickered in Gareth's eyes. Disappointment, maybe, or understanding. He nodded and carefully transferred Charlotte back to her arms, his fingers brushing hers in the process. The contact was brief, professional, but it sent heat shooting through her veins. I'll be in my office if you need anything, he said, but he didn't move immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching her settle Charlotte into the feeding position, his expression unreadable. Gareth, she said softly, not looking up from the baby. She's going to be okay. You both are. I hope so, he said, and there was something in his voice that made her think he wasn't just talking about Charlotte anymore. After he left, Sabrina sat in the rocking chair with Charlotte, but her mind was spinning with dangerous thoughts. She'd been hired to save a baby's life, but somewhere along the way, she'd started caring about the man who'd been afraid to love his own daughter. She'd started seeing past the grief and the walls to the person he'd been before tragedy had changed him. And that was a problem, because temporary arrangements weren't supposed to feel this much like home. Charlotte finished feeding and dozed off in her arms, but Sabrina didn't move. She sat there in the golden afternoon light, holding a baby who wasn't hers, in a house that would never be home, loving a man who was still married to a ghost. It was a recipe for heartbreak, and she was walking straight into it with her eyes wide open. Outside, the first leaves of autumn were beginning to fall, and Sabrina couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. The safe, professional distance she'd been maintaining was crumbling, and in its place was something far more dangerous, something that felt like family, something that felt like love, and something that was going to destroy her when it was time to leave. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. The past arrived at the Hobson estate at exactly 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in Chanel and carrying enough grief to destroy everything Sabrina had built. Catherine Sinclair had always been beautiful, but 18 months of mourning had refined her features into something almost ethereal. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, her blue eyes held the kind of sadness that never quite faded, and her designer dress hung on a frame grown too thin from forgetting to eat. "Where is she?" Catherine demanded, standing in the marble foyer like an avenging angel. "Where is this woman who's supposedly saving Charlotte's life?" From the top of the staircase, Sabrina watched the scene unfold with growing unease. She'd been heading downstairs when she heard the commotion, and something about the blonde woman's voice had stopped her cold. There was pain in it, yes, but also a territorial fury that made Sabrina's protective instincts flare. "Catherine!" Gareth's voice came from his office, and Sabrina saw him emerge into the foyer, his expression immediately guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I'm trying to find out why my sister's baby is being nursed by a complete stranger while you hide in your office like a coward." Catherine's voice rose to a pitch that would have been shrill if it hadn't been so full of anguish. The words hit Gareth like physical blows, and Sabrina saw him flinch, She wanted to defend him, but stayed frozen on the stairs, knowing her presence would only make things worse. "Charlotte is fine," Gareth said, his voice carefully controlled. "She's healthy and growing. She's being breastfed by a stranger." Catherine's composure shattered completely. "My sister is barely cold in her grave, and you've already replaced her with some woman who's playing house with her baby." "It's not like that," Gareth said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Catherine was crying now, tears streaming down her face as 18 months of suppressed grief finally found its target. "Tell me, where does she sleep? In the guest room? Or have you moved her into the master suite already?" "The guest room," Sabrina said quietly, finally walking down the stairs. "I sleep in the guest room near the nursery so I can hear Charlotte at night." "How convenient," Catherine said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And what happens when Charlotte doesn't need night feedings? Will you find other reasons to stay? Other ways to make yourself indispensable?" The questions hit too close to home, echoing doubts that had been plaguing Sabrina for days. She'd been falling in love with this family, with Charlotte and with Gareth, and Catherine's accusations forced her to confront that truth. "I'm here to help Charlotte," she said, but even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. "Are you?" Catherine stepped closer, and Sabrina could smell expensive perfume mixed with the faint scent of gin. "Or are you here to help yourself to my sister's life? You're playing house with a grieving widower and his motherless baby, pretending it's altruistic, but I can see the way you look at him." "Catherine," Gareth's voice cracked like a whip, "you will not speak to Sabrina that way. Not in my house." "Your house?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "This was Catherine's house. That's Catherine's baby upstairs. And that woman is trying to erase every trace of my sister's existence." "That's not true," Sabrina said, her voice stronger now. "I talk to Charlotte about her mother every day. I tell her how much Catherine loved her, how she chose every detail of the nursery." "You didn't know her," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "You didn't know how she laughed, or how she cried when she found out she was pregnant, or how she spent hours talking to her belly." The words painted a picture of a woman Sabrina would never meet, and for the first time since arriving, she felt the full weight of what she'd taken on. She wasn't just caring for a baby, she was standing in for a ghost. "You're right," she said quietly. "I didn't know Catherine, but Charlotte can't wait for her mother to come back from the dead." "How dare you?" Catherine breathed, her face going white. "How dare I what? Save her life? Because that's what I did. Charlotte was dying and no one else could help her. Because he was grieving." Catherine's voice broke. "Because he lost the love of his life, and instead of giving him time to heal, you swooped in and made yourself indispensable." "I made myself useful," Sabrina shot back, her professional composure finally cracking. "There's a difference." "Is there? Then why are you still here? Charlotte is healthy now. So why haven't you left?" The question hit Sabrina like a physical blow because she didn't have a good answer. Charlotte was thriving, gaining weight and strength every day. There was no medical reason for Sabrina to stay. "Because she needs consistency," she said, the words coming out broken. "She needs her father," Catherine interrupted. "She needs Gareth to stop hiding behind you and start being a parent." "I'm not hiding behind anyone," Gareth said, his voice deadly quiet. "Aren't you?" Catherine turned to face him, 18 months of suppressed grief and fury in her expression. "You've been sleepwalking through your daughter's life while playing house with a stranger. Catherine would be ashamed of you." The words hit Gareth like a physical blow, and Sabrina saw him stagger. She wanted to go to him, but Catherine wasn't finished. "She died bringing Charlotte into this world," Catherine continued, her voice shaking. "She died so your daughter could live, and you've repaid that sacrifice by abandoning Charlotte to strangers." Sabrina isn't playing anything, Gareth said, but his voice was weak. Look at her, Gareth. Really look at her. She's living in your house, caring for your child, and you're looking at her like she's the answer to all your prayers. But she's not Catherine. She'll never be Catherine. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence, and Sabrina watched Gareth's face go white. She'd seen him struggle with guilt, but never look so destroyed. That's enough, she said, stepping between them. This isn't helping anyone. You don't get to play peacemaker in a family that isn't yours, Catherine said, her fury focused on Sabrina. You don't get to pretend you belong here. I belong wherever Charlotte needs me to be, Sabrina said steadily. Do you? Then ask yourself why you really stayed. Was it for Charlotte, or was it for him? The question hit its mark, and Sabrina felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been asking herself the same thing for days. I stayed because Charlotte needed me, she said, but the words felt hollow. Liar, Catherine said softly. You stayed because you saw an opportunity. A grieving widower, a motherless baby, a chance to step into a life that was never meant to be yours. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Sabrina said, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to try, Catherine said, and there was something almost pitying in her voice now. You just have to be here. You just have to be alive when Catherine isn't. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything said and unsaid. Somewhere in the distance, a baby started to cry. Charlotte was awake and she was hungry, and she needed her father to decide what came next. All of them did. Chapter 5. The Rival's Gambit. The war for Hobson Steel began at exactly 9:30 on a Wednesday morning when Harrison Pemberton walked into the Manhattan boardroom like a shark who'd scented blood in the water. Gareth sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his sharp gaze scanning quarterly reports that should have commanded his full attention. But his mind was back in Connecticut, reeling from Catherine's accusations and the devastating realization that she might be right. Maybe he was using Sabrina as a shield against his own grief. Gentlemen, Harrison said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a predator who'd been planning his attack for months. I trust you've all reviewed my proposal. Gareth forced himself to focus on the man who'd been circling Hobson Steel like a vulture since Catherine's death. Harrison Pemberton embodied everything Gareth despised about corporate raiders: ruthless, calculating, and completely without honor. Your proposal is insulting, Theodore Fairchild said from Gareth's right. Hobson Steel isn't struggling. We're not interested in selling. Aren't you? Harrison's smile was sharp as a blade. The word on the street is that your CEO has been distracted. Family troubles, I hear. The words hit their target with surgical precision, and Gareth felt every eye in the room turn to him. The board members, men who'd trusted him to build their empire, were studying his face for signs of weakness. My personal life doesn't affect my business decisions, Gareth said, his voice carrying ice that had frozen out countless competitors. Doesn't it? Harrison pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. Then explain why Hobson Steel's stock has dropped 12% in 6 months, why the Pittsburgh contract was delayed, why your CFO has been running meetings instead of you. Each accusation was carefully aimed, and Gareth realized Harrison had been doing his homework. Someone had been feeding him information about Gareth's absences, his emotional state since Catherine's death. Temporary setbacks, Theodore said smoothly. But Gareth could hear the concern in his friend's voice. Temporary? Harrison laughed. We're talking about a CEO who hasn't attended a board meeting in person in 2 months. A man so consumed with grief that he's forgotten his shareholders. That's enough, Gareth said, his voice deadly quiet. I don't think you understand your position, Hobson. Your personal crisis has become a business liability. Your shareholders are asking questions. The threat was clear. Harrison had been talking to major shareholders, building a case for hostile takeover using Gareth's grief as ammunition. "The board has full confidence in Gareth's leadership," said William Bradford, the longest-serving member. "Do they?" Harrison showed financial projections. "These numbers tell a different story: missed deadlines, delayed contracts, a CEO more concerned with his personal life than his responsibilities." Gareth felt rage building in his chest, the white-hot fury that had driven him to build an empire. Harrison was using Catherine's death as a weapon against him. "You want to see leadership," Gareth said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You want to see what happens when someone threatens everything I've built?" He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and everyone felt the atmosphere shift. This wasn't the grief-stricken widower Harrison had counted on. This was the steel magnate who'd crushed every competitor who dared challenge him. "Theodore," Gareth said, never taking his eyes off Harrison, "cancel my afternoon meetings. I want a full financial audit by tomorrow morning, profit projections for 5 years, and detailed analysis of every contract we've signed in 6 months. "Gareth," Theodore started, but Gareth cut him off. "I want to know exactly how much Harrison's whisper campaign has cost us, and then I want to show our shareholders what real leadership looks like." Harrison's confidence flickered momentarily. "It's too late for damage control. Your reputation is already—" "My reputation," Gareth interrupted, "was built on 30 years of making shareholders richer than they dreamed possible. One bad quarter doesn't erase 3 decades of success." "But it raises questions about your judgment," Harrison pressed, "about whether a man dealing with tragedy can make the hard decisions modern business requires." "You're right about one thing," Gareth said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I have been distracted. I've been dealing with personal issues that temporarily affected my focus." Harrison's satisfaction was visible, but Gareth wasn't finished. "But those issues are resolved now," he continued, "and I'm about to remind you why nobody tries to take what's mine." The steel in his voice could have cut diamond, and Harrison's smile faltered. Around the table, board members were sitting straighter, remembering why they'd trusted Gareth Hobson. "Mr. Pemberton seems to think grief makes a man weak," Gareth said, addressing the room. "He's about to learn how wrong he is." "What are you saying?" Harrison asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I'm saying you just declared war on the wrong man at the wrong time. You mistook temporary distraction for permanent weakness, and you're about to discover what happens when you threaten everything a man has left to lose." "The Shanghai deal," Theodore said suddenly, understanding dawning. Gareth's smile was sharp as a knife. "Among other things, Harrison seems to think we're vulnerable. Time to show him how wrong he is." The Shanghai deal was a massive infrastructure contract worth over $500 million. Gareth had been holding back, waiting for the perfect moment to close. That moment had arrived. "You can't possibly close Shanghai in 6 months, Harrison said, doubt creeping into his voice. "Watch me," Gareth said simply. "Theodore, I want you on a plane to Shanghai tomorrow. Take the full team. Whatever it takes to close that deal, do it." "That's a hell of a risk," William Bradford said quietly. "It won't fail," Gareth said with absolute confidence, "because I'm going to close it personally, and when I do, Mr. Pemberton's takeover attempt will look like the pathetic power grab it is." Harrison was rallying. "Even if you close Shanghai, you're still dealing with the fundamental problem. Your judgment is compromised." "You're right," Gareth said, surprising everyone. "They do deserve better. They deserve a CEO who's fully committed to their success." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Which is why I'm implementing new policies to ensure Hobson Steel remains the industry leader for the next 30 years. We're expanding Asian operations, investing in new technology, and diversifying our portfolio in ways that will make our current success look like a warm-up act." Around the table, board members' excitement was building as they remembered why they'd trusted him. "This is inspiring," Harrison said, his voice lacking earlier confidence, "but it doesn't address the core issue. You're emotionally compromised." "My judgment," Gareth interrupted, "is that you've overstayed your welcome in my boardroom." The dismissal was absolute, and Harrison's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He'd expected to find a broken man, easy prey for his ambitions. Instead, he'd awakened Gareth's killer instinct. "This isn't over," Harrison said, gathering his materials. "Yes, it is," Gareth replied calmly. "It was over the moment you used my wife's death as a weapon against me." After Harrison left, the room was silent. Then William Bradford started to chuckle, the sound spreading around the table. "Jesus, Gareth," Theodore said, shaking his head in amazement. "I thought we were dead. I thought he had us." "He never had us," Gareth said, settling back into his chair. "He had information and timing, but he made one crucial mistake." "What's that?" "He assumed pain makes a man weak," Gareth said, his voice carrying weight that spoke to experiences beyond business. "He didn't understand that sometimes loss makes a man realize exactly what he's willing to fight for." Catherine's accusations had stripped away his illusions, forced him to confront the choices he'd been avoiding. Harrison's attack had crystallized his priorities, reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost. "So what's the plan?" Theodore asked. "Simple," Gareth said. "We show the world what Hobson Steel is really capable of. We close deals others say are impossible. We expand into markets others fear to enter, and we remind everyone why we're the best." "And Harrison?" Gareth's smile was sharp as glass. "Harrison Pemberton just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. By the time I'm finished with him, he'll be lucky to get a job selling used cars." But as the meeting broke up, Gareth found his thoughts drifting back to Connecticut, back to a baby learning to thrive and a woman who'd saved both their lives. Catherine had accused him of hiding behind Sabrina. Harrison had used his family distraction as a weapon. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to decide what he was really fighting for. Because somewhere between the corporate warfare and family drama, Gareth had realized something that terrified him more than any hostile takeover. He was falling in love with Sabrina Fisher, and that changed everything. Chapter 6. Scandal and Sacrifice. The photograph that destroyed everything appeared on page 6 at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, beneath a headline that would haunt Sabrina Fisher forever. "Billionaire's baby mama, steel tycoons live-in, nurse sparks romance rumors." The image was devastating in its intimacy. Sabrina standing in the nursery window, Charlotte cradled against her chest, while Gareth's reflection was visible in the glass behind her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Someone with a telephoto lens had captured the exact moment that would confirm every whispered suspicion. Sabrina stared at her phone screen in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands trembling as she scrolled through endless notifications. The story had exploded across social media like wildfire, spawning thousands of vicious comments about her motives. "Gold digger alert, she saw a grieving billionaire and moved right in." "Disgusting, his wife isn't even cold and he's playing house with the help." Each word was a knife to her heart, but she forced herself to keep reading. The article was character assassination, presenting carefully selected facts in the most damaging light possible. Sources close to the family confirm that 30-year-old nurse Sabrina Fisher has been living in the Connecticut mansion for over 6 weeks, providing what insiders describe as intimate care for 9-month-old Charlotte Hobson. They'd made it sound like she'd manufactured Charlotte's illness to insert herself into their lives. They'd twisted her life-saving decision into something sordid and calculating. Eleanor entered with coffee and a grim expression. "Mr. Hobson is in his office with his lawyers. He's been on the phone since 4 this morning." "How bad is it?" Sabrina asked, though she already knew. "Bad," Eleanor said simply. Channel 7 ran a segment. The Hartford Courant picked it up. The Wall Street Journal is running a piece about how the scandal might affect Hobson Steel's stock price. Sabrina closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. She'd come here to save a baby's life, and instead become the center of a media storm threatening to destroy everything Gareth had built. "There's more," Eleanor continued gently. "Someone leaked information about your background. They know about your student loans, your apartment, your work history. They're painting a picture of a woman who saw an opportunity." Her student loans, over $80,000, were being presented as evidence of financial desperation. Her modest apartment was being contrasted with the Hobson estate's luxury. Her previous cases were being scrutinized for inappropriate involvement. "They're destroying my career," she said flatly. "No family will ever hire me again. They've turned saving a baby's life into a scandal." "You saved that child's life," Eleanor said firmly. "Everything else is noise." But it wasn't just noise. In private nursing, reputation was everything. The photograph had shattered her professional credibility in a single image. "I have to go," Sabrina said, standing abruptly. "I have to pack and leave before this gets worse." "And Charlotte?" Eleanor's question was devastating. Sabrina felt tears at the mention of the baby who'd become her world. Charlotte was thriving, gaining weight and strength daily, but she was also bonded to Sabrina in ways that went beyond nutrition. "Charlotte will be fine," she said, though the lie tasted like ash. "She's healthy now. Any qualified nanny can care for her." "You don't believe that any more than I do," Eleanor said gently. "That child loves you. You're not just her caregiver, you're her security, her world." The words broke something inside Sabrina's chest. She'd tried to maintain professional boundaries, but had fallen completely in love with the tiny girl who'd fought so hard to live. "I can't stay," she said, her voice breaking. "Not when my presence is destroying Gareth's reputation." "What if he doesn't want you to go?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities Sabrina couldn't afford to consider. She'd seen how Gareth looked at her lately, felt the electricity when their hands touched, noticed how he found excuses to be in the nursery. "It doesn't matter," she said firmly. "I won't be the reason his company fails. I won't be the scandal that destroys everything he's built." Eleanor studied her with knowing eyes. "You love him, and he loves you. That's what this is really about." "This is about protecting Charlotte," Sabrina said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it right to abandon a child who's already lost her mother?" Eleanor asked. "Is it right to run from the first man who's made you feel alive in years?" The questions hit too close to home. She did love Gareth, not just as Charlotte's father, but as a man who'd shown her glimpses of who he'd been before grief changed him. But love wasn't enough when it came at the cost of everything he'd worked for. "I have to go," she repeated, moving toward her suitcase. "Before this gets worse." She was packing when Charlotte's cries echoed through the house. The baby was awake, probably hungry, definitely confused by the tension building since the scandal broke. Sabrina's body responded automatically, but she forced herself to keep packing, to ignore the maternal instincts that had gotten her into this mess. The crying grew more desperate, and Sabrina felt tears streaming down her face. She was abandoning Charlotte, just like every other caregiver had. She was proving she couldn't be trusted, couldn't be the stable presence a traumatized child needed. "She's asking for you." Gareth's voice came from the doorway, rough with exhaustion and desperation. She turned to face him, her suitcase half-packed, her face streaked with tears. He looked like he hadn't slept all night, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes hollow with defeat. "I can't," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can't see her again. It'll just make leaving harder. For who? He asked, stepping into the room. For you or for her? The question was like a slap. For both of us, she admitted. For all of us. What if I told you I don't care about the scandal? Gareth's voice was quiet, but intense. What if I told you that losing you would be worse than losing everything else? I'd say you're not thinking clearly, she replied, though her hands had stopped packing. I'd say you're letting emotion cloud your judgment. Maybe I am, he admitted, moving closer. Or maybe I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in months. Maybe I'm finally admitting that what I feel for you goes beyond gratitude. The words hung between them, dangerous and wonderful and absolutely impossible. Sabrina felt her heart racing, felt the walls she'd built around her feelings beginning to crack. Gareth, she said, his name coming out like a prayer. We can't. Not like this. Not when it'll destroy everything you've worked for. What if I told you that none of it matters without you? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. What if I told you that I'd rather lose the company than lose you? Then I'd say you're grieving and confused and not thinking about what's best for Charlotte, Sabrina said, though her voice was shaking. I'd say you're mixing up gratitude with something else. Am I? He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. Because I'm pretty sure I know the difference between gratitude and falling in love. The words hit her like a physical blow, and Sabrina felt her knees go weak. He loved her. The man she'd been trying not to love, the man whose child she'd saved, the man whose life she was about to destroy. He loved her. You don't mean that, she whispered. You can't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life, he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I love you, Sabrina. I love the way you care for Charlotte, the way you see through my walls, the way you make me feel alive again. I love you, and I'm not going to let some tabloid scandal drive you away. You have to, she said, tears streaming down her face. You have to let me go, because if I stay, they'll destroy you. They'll destroy Hobson Steel, your reputation, everything you've built, and I can't live with that. Then we'll build something new, he said simply, something that can't be destroyed by lies and speculation. Like what? She asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Like a family, he said, his voice soft but certain. Like a real family, built on love instead of obligation. The words painted a picture too beautiful to contemplate, a life where she didn't have to leave, where Charlotte could grow up with both of them, where love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But it was a fantasy, and they both knew it. I have to go, she said, turning back to her suitcase. I have to leave before I make this worse. What if I asked you to stay? Gareth's voice was quiet but desperate. What if I got down on my knees and begged you not to leave us? Sabrina closed her eyes, feeling her heart break into 1,000 pieces. Then I'd say that you're the most wonderful man I've ever known, and that's exactly why I have to protect you from this. She finished packing in silence while he watched, her hands moving automatically while her heart shattered. When she was done, she turned to face him one last time, memorizing every detail of his face. Take care of Charlotte, she said, her voice barely audible. Love her enough for both of us. Sabrina, please, she whispered. Please don't make this harder than it already is. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, each step feeling like walking through quicksand. At the threshold, she paused, looking back at the room where she'd been happier than she'd ever been in her life. I love you too, she said, the words coming out broken and raw. I love you both. That's why I have to go. She walked out of the room, out of the house, out of the life she'd never been meant to have. Behind her, she could hear Charlotte crying, the sound following her down the hallway, down the stairs, out into the cold morning air. By the time she reached her car, the tears were flowing freely. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking back at the house where she'd left her heart, before finally starting the engine and driving away. In the rearview mirror, she saw Gareth standing in the doorway, holding Charlotte in his arms, watching her leave. The image burned itself into her memory, a picture of everything she was giving up to protect them. The scandal would die down eventually. The reporters would move on to other stories. Gareth would rebuild his reputation, and Charlotte would grow up safe and loved. And Sabrina would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been if she'd been brave enough to stay and fight for the family they could have been. But sometimes, she told herself as she drove toward an uncertain future, love meant knowing when to let go, even when it destroyed you in the process. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. 3 weeks after Sabrina Fisher walked out of his life, Gareth Hobson stood in the nursery at 2 a.m, holding his dying daughter, and finally understanding what true helplessness felt like. Charlotte's cries had started at midnight, weak, plaintive sounds that tore at his heart. She'd refused the bottle Eleanor had prepared, turning her head away from formula with the same desperate rejection that had nearly killed her months ago. Now, at barely 12 pounds instead of her healthy weight, she was fading again. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice rough with exhaustion and growing panic. "Please eat something, please." But Charlotte only continued her weak crying, her tiny fists clenching as she searched for something that wasn't there. Someone who wasn't there. The woman who'd saved her life and then disappeared into the night, leaving them both broken. The new nanny, Patricia Sullivan, highly recommended by the Whitmore agency, had lasted exactly 5 days before admitting defeat. The one before her had made it 3. They were all qualified, all experienced, all completely incapable of reaching the child who'd bonded to someone else's voice, touch, love. "Mr. Hobson," Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. "How is she?" "She's not eating," he said flatly. "She took maybe an ounce this afternoon, nothing since dinner." Eleanor's expression tightened. In 3 weeks, Charlotte had lost precious weight, her bright alertness fading into the same listless withdrawal that had terrified them before. Losing Sabrina had broken something fundamental in the child. "Have you called Dr. Whitmore?" Eleanor asked. "She's coming first thing in the morning," Gareth said, though they both knew what the doctor would say. Charlotte needed the one thing they couldn't give her, the woman who'd risked everything to save her life. "Sir," Eleanor said carefully, "perhaps it's time to consider calling Miss Fisher." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with everything they'd been trying not to say for 3 weeks. Gareth had thought about it every day, had picked up the phone dozens of times before forcing himself to put it down. Sabrina had sacrificed everything to protect them from the scandal. Calling her now would make that sacrifice meaningless. "I can't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't see her face when she left, Eleanor. You didn't see what it cost her to walk away. I can't ask her to come back to this. Even if it saves Charlotte's life." The question hit him like a physical blow, because that's what it came down to. His pride, his guilt, his need to protect Sabrina from further pain. All meaningless if Charlotte didn't survive. "The scandal hasn't died down," he said, though the words felt hollow. "If anything, it's gotten worse. They're calling her a gold digger, a home wrecker. Her reputation is destroyed." "And you believe that?" "Of course not," Gareth said sharply, "but that doesn't change the fact that her career is over. She can't work in private nursing anymore because of what happened here." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "What if Miss Fisher's career doesn't matter to her as much as Charlotte's life?" It has to matter, Gareth said. She worked too hard to build that career. I can't be the reason she loses everything. But you can be the reason she loses Charlotte. The words hit their mark, and Gareth felt something crack inside his chest. He was allowing his own guilt and pride to keep him from making the call that might save his daughter's life. I don't know where she is, he admitted. I don't know if she'd even answer if I called. Theodore might know, Eleanor suggested gently. He's been handling the legal aspects. He might have contact information. Gareth looked down at Charlotte, who had finally quieted but was staring up at him with enormous blue eyes that held too much sadness for a baby. She was waiting, he realized. Waiting for the voice that had sung her to sleep, the touch that had made her feel safe, the love that had taught her to trust the world. Call him, he said finally. Tell him it's an emergency. Eleanor nodded and hurried from the room, leaving Gareth alone with his daughter and the weight of everything he'd failed to protect. The scandal had been brutal, just as Sabrina had predicted. Hobson Steele's stock had taken a hit, though the Shanghai deal had cushioned the blow. His personal life had become tabloid fodder. But none of that mattered now, not when he was watching his daughter slip away again. His phone buzzed with a text from Theodore. Found her. Hartford General, Pediatric Ward, night shift. Hartford General. Less than an hour away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the world. Gareth closed his eyes, trying to imagine walking into that hospital, finding Sabrina in her scrubs, asking her to come back to the life she'd sacrificed everything to escape. Sir? Eleanor was back, her expression cautious. Mr. Fairchild says Miss Fisher is working at Hartford General. He says she's been asking about Charlotte. The words hit Gareth like a revelation. Sabrina had been asking about Charlotte, which meant she was thinking about her, worrying about her, maybe even suffering the same kind of separation that was slowly killing them both. What did Ted tell her? He asked. Nothing specific, Eleanor said. Just that Charlotte was adjusting to the change. Adjusting. The word was such a pale description of what Charlotte was actually going through, the weight loss, the withdrawal, the desperate searching for a face that never appeared. I have to go, Gareth said suddenly, his decision crystallizing into action. I have to go to Hartford and find her. Mr. Hobson, Eleanor said carefully, it's 3 a.m. Perhaps you should wait. No, he said, his voice carrying the steel that had built his empire. I've waited too long already. I've let pride and guilt and fear keep me from doing what I should have done weeks ago. And what's that? Fighting for what matters, he said simply. Fighting for Charlotte. Fighting for Sabrina. Fighting for the family we could be if I stopped being a coward. Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. I'll call Patricia and ask her to come watch Charlotte. No, Gareth said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Charlotte's coming with me. If I'm going to ask Sabrina to come back, she needs to see what her leaving has cost. Sir, it's the middle of the night. The baby will be cold, tired. The baby is dying, Gareth said bluntly. She's dying because I was too proud to call the one person who could save her. If taking her out in the cold night air is what it takes to bring Sabrina home, then that's what we'll do. 20 minutes later, Gareth was driving through the empty Connecticut countryside with Charlotte secured in her car seat, her weak cries the only sound in the luxury sedan. She was bundled in the pink blanket that Sabrina had bought her, the one that still smelled faintly of the perfume that had become associated with safety and love. The drive to Hartford General took 45 minutes. With each mile that passed, Gareth's certainty grew. He wasn't just driving to save Charlotte's life. He was driving to reclaim his own. Because somewhere in the week since Sabrina had left, he'd realized that losing her had been worse than losing Catherine, not because he'd loved Catherine less, but because losing Sabrina had been a choice he'd made out of fear and pride instead of love. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty at 4 in the morning. Gareth parked close to the entrance, then carefully lifted Charlotte from her car seat. She was so light, so fragile, so different from the thriving baby she'd been just weeks ago. "We're going to find her," he whispered to Charlotte as they approached the automatic doors. "We're going to find Sabrina and bring her home." The pediatric ward was on the 4th floor. The nurses' station was staffed by a single woman who looked up in surprise as they approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes moving from Gareth's expensive suit to the baby in his arms. "I'm looking for Sabrina Fisher," he said. "It's a family emergency." The nurse's expression shifted, and Gareth saw recognition flicker in her eyes. She'd heard about the scandal, had probably read the stories, but she also saw a desperate father with a sick child, and that trumped everything else. "Room 412, she said quietly. "She's with the Morrison baby." Gareth nodded his thanks and walked down the sterile hallway, his footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn quiet. Room 412 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. He could hear a familiar voice coming from inside, soft and musical, and exactly what Charlotte needed to hear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Sabrina was saying. "I know you're scared, but the surgery went well. You're going to be fine. Your mommy and daddy will be here soon." Gareth paused outside the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment that would determine whether they had a future or whether he'd spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. He knocked softly and heard Sabrina's voice call out, "Come in." He pushed the door open and stepped into the room, Charlotte still in his arms. Sabrina was sitting beside a small bed, holding the hand of a toddler who was sleeping peacefully. She looked up as he entered, and the shock on her face nearly brought him to his knees. "Gareth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" "I came to ask you to come home," he said simply. "We need you, Sabrina. Charlotte needs you." As if summoned by the sound of Sabrina's voice, Charlotte's weak cries suddenly intensified, her tiny arms reaching toward the woman who'd saved her life. Sabrina's professional composure cracked, and Gareth saw tears streaming down her face. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, standing and moving toward them. "Oh, my sweet girl. What's wrong?" "She's not eating," Gareth said, his voice breaking. "She's lost weight, stopped responding to anyone else. She's dying, Sabrina. She's dying without you." Sabrina's hands were shaking as she reached for Charlotte, and the moment the baby was in her arms, the crying stopped. Charlotte nestled against Sabrina's chest with a sigh of pure relief, as if she'd finally found her way home. "I'm here," Sabrina whispered, her voice thick with tears. "I'm here, baby girl. I'm here." Gareth watched the reunion with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. This was what he'd been denying Charlotte for 3 weeks. The love of the woman who'd become her mother in everything but name. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Sabrina. I should have called you weeks ago. I should have fought for you instead of letting you walk away." "You were protecting me," she said, though her eyes never left Charlotte's face. "I was being a coward," he said. "I was so afraid of the scandal, so afraid of what people would say, that I forgot what actually mattered. I forgot that love is worth fighting for." "Gareth, I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I love you, and I don't care who knows it. I don't care what it costs me. I just care about you and Charlotte and the family we could be if you'll give us another chance." Sabrina was crying openly now, her tears falling onto Charlotte's blanket. "The scandal..." "We'll die down," he said firmly. "People will find other stories to obsess over, but Charlotte will only have one chance to grow up with the woman who saved her life." "I don't know if I can do this again," she whispered. "I don't know if I can survive losing you both twice." "Then don't lose us," Gareth said, stepping closer. "Come home with us. Marry me. Be Charlotte's mother and my wife, and to hell with what anyone else thinks." The words hung in the air between them, a proposal born of desperation and love, and the absolute certainty that they belonged together. Sabrina looked down at Charlotte, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in weeks, then up at Gareth with eyes that held 1,000 different emotions. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Are you absolutely sure this is what you want?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said. "I want you, Sabrina. I want all of you, for the rest of my life." "Yes," she whispered, the word coming out like a prayer. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll come home. Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, careful not to disturb Charlotte, who was finally sleeping peacefully between them. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and promises, of love that had survived scandal and separation, of a future that was worth any price they might have to pay. "Let's go home," he said against her lips. "Let's take our daughter home." Sabrina nodded, her face radiant with happiness and relief. "Home," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, let's go home." As they left the hospital together, Charlotte secure in Sabrina's arms, Gareth realized that the scandal had been worth it. The pain, the separation, the fear. All of it had been worth it because it had forced them to choose what mattered most. They'd chosen each other. They'd chosen love. And in the end, that was the only choice that really mattered. Chapter 8. Love's True Courage. The morning after Sabrina returned to the Hobson estate, she woke up in the master bedroom for the first time, sunlight streaming through the windows Catherine had chosen, in the bed where Gareth's wife had died giving birth to their daughter. It should have felt wrong. Instead, it felt like coming home. Gareth was already awake beside her, his eyes soft as he watched her emerge from sleep. They'd talked until dawn, planning their future, addressing obstacles they'd face, reaffirming the love that had survived scandal and separation. "Good morning, Mrs. Hobson-to-be," he said softly, his voice warm with affection. "We're not married yet," Sabrina said, though she couldn't suppress her smile. The engagement ring on her finger, Catherine's ring, offered with trembling hands and accepted with tears, caught the morning light. "Details," Gareth murmured, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "How did you sleep?" "Like the dead," she admitted, then immediately regretted the phrase. But Gareth just smiled, understanding they were both learning to navigate the balance between honoring the past and embracing the future. "Charlotte?" she asked, already starting to sit up. "Still sleeping," he said, gently pulling her back down. "Eleanor checked an hour ago. She's peaceful for the first time in weeks." Sabrina nodded, relief flooding through her. The reunion with Charlotte the night before had been everything she'd hoped for. The baby had latched immediately, drinking with desperate hunger. By the time they'd gotten home, Charlotte was already looking more alert. "We need to talk about logistics," Sabrina said, her practical nature asserting itself. "The media will have a field day when they find out I'm back. The engagement will fuel more speculation." "Let them speculate," Gareth said, his voice carrying the steel that had built his empire. "I don't care what they say anymore. I care about protecting our family." Our family. The words sent warmth through Sabrina's chest, but also brought anxiety. Building a family with Gareth meant stepping permanently into Catherine's shoes, becoming mistress of an estate she'd never been meant to inherit. "What about Catherine?" she asked quietly. "She's going to fight this." Gareth's expression hardened slightly. Catherine's grief doesn't give her the right to dictate my life, and it certainly doesn't give her the right to decide what's best for Charlotte. But she's Charlotte's aunt. She's family. So are you, Gareth said firmly. You've been more of a mother to Charlotte than anyone else. Catherine can either accept that or stay away. The words were spoken with absolute conviction, but Sabrina could see the pain underneath. Gareth was choosing between the woman who connected him to his dead wife and the woman who represented his future. "I don't want to come between you and your family," she said. "You're not coming between us," Gareth said, reaching up to cup her face. "Catherine is putting herself between us. There's a difference." Before Sabrina could respond, Charlotte's cries drifted through the baby monitor. Immediately, both of them were moving, their bodies responding with automatic precision. "We'll get her," Gareth said, taking her hand. Together. They walked to the nursery hand in hand, and Sabrina felt rightness settle over her. This was how it was supposed to be. Both parents responding to their child's needs, sharing responsibility and joy. Charlotte was standing in her crib, bouncing excitedly. When she saw them enter together, her face lit up with a smile that could have powered the mansion. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sabrina said, lifting Charlotte into her arms. "Did you sleep well?" Charlotte babbled happily, her hands reaching for Sabrina's face with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. The weight loss from the past 3 weeks was still evident, but her color was better, her eyes brighter. "I have something to ask you," Gareth said, as Sabrina settled into the rocking chair to nurse Charlotte. "Something important." "More important than agreeing to marry you?" she asked, adjusting Charlotte with practiced ease. "Different important," he said, his voice carrying weight that made her look up. "I want you to be Charlotte's legal mother. I want to start adoption proceedings immediately." The words hit Sabrina like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they represented something she'd never dared hope for. Legal motherhood meant permanence, protection, the absolute certainty that no one could ever take Charlotte away. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once the adoption is finalized, Charlotte will legally be my daughter. Forever." "She already is your daughter," he said simply, "in every way that matters. The legal part is just paperwork." Sabrina looked down at Charlotte, who was nursing contentedly, her tiny hand resting trustingly on Sabrina's chest. The baby who'd been dying when they first met, who'd fought so hard to live, who'd chosen Sabrina as her source of life and love. "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I want to adopt her. I want to be her mother in every possible way." Gareth smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face. "Good, because I've already called the lawyers. They're drawing up papers today." "Today?" Sabrina laughed through her tears. "You don't waste any time." "I've wasted enough time," he said seriously. 3 weeks of watching Charlotte fade taught me that time is too precious to waste on hesitation." Charlotte finished nursing and dozed off in Sabrina's arms, her face peaceful and content. As Sabrina held her, she felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. Mother, wife, mistress of an estate with centuries of history. "I have a condition," she said suddenly. Gareth raised an eyebrow. "A condition for the adoption?" "A condition for the marriage," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I want to be your equal partner in everything. The business, the finances, decisions about Charlotte's future. I don't want to be just the wife who stays home while you run the world." "Sabrina." "I'm serious," she said, cutting him off. "I didn't give up my career to become a decorative accessory. I want to be involved. I want to contribute. I want to build something together." Gareth studied her for a long moment, processing the request. He was used to being in control, making decisions unilaterally. Sharing that power would be an adjustment. What did you have in mind? He asked finally. A foundation, she said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke, focused on maternal and infant health, helping families like ours, babies like Charlotte. I want to use what we've learned to help other people. A foundation, he repeated, and she could see the wheels turning. That's brilliant. Tax advantages, positive publicity, genuine social impact. I don't care about tax advantages, Sabrina said firmly. I care about making sure no other family goes through what we did. No other baby suffers because there aren't enough resources. I know, Gareth said quickly. I just meant it's smart on multiple levels. Sabrina nodded, feeling purpose settling over her. I want to work with hospitals, train nurses in specialized infant care, fund research into feeding disorders. I want to turn our pain into something productive. Our pain, Gareth repeated softly. I like that. Our pain, our healing, our future. Is that a yes? She asked. To the partnership? That's a yes to everything, he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Equal partners in business, parenting, life. I wouldn't want it any other way. The sound of the doorbell interrupted their conversation, followed by Eleanor's voice from downstairs. Mr. Hobson, Dr. Whitmore is here. Gareth glanced at his watch. I called her last night. I wanted her to check Charlotte, make sure the separation didn't cause lasting damage. Good thinking, Sabrina said, though she felt nervousness flutter. Dr. Whitmore had been Catherine's friend, had known her for years. How would she react to finding Sabrina not just back, but wearing Catherine's ring and planning to become Charlotte's legal mother? It'll be fine, Gareth said, reading her expression. Margaret cares about Charlotte above everything else. She'll be thrilled to see her healthy again. They made their way downstairs, Charlotte alert and curious in Sabrina's arms. Dr. Whitmore was waiting in the living room, her medical bag at her side, her expression professionally neutral until she saw Charlotte. My goodness, she said, her face breaking into a smile. Look at that color. Look at those bright eyes. She looks like a completely different baby. She's been eating well, Sabrina said, settling onto the sofa, 4 times since midnight. And sleeping peacefully between feedings, Gareth added. No crying, no fussing. Dr. Whitmore nodded, pulling out her stethoscope. May I? She asked, and Sabrina immediately handed Charlotte over. As the doctor examined Charlotte, Sabrina studied her face for signs of judgment or disapproval. But Dr. Whitmore seemed focused entirely on her patient, checking reflexes, listening to her heart, testing responses with genuine care. She's perfect, Dr. Whitmore announced finally. Absolutely perfect. Her heart rate is excellent, reflexes normal, and she's clearly gained weight since last night. So the separation didn't cause permanent damage? Gareth asked. None that I can detect, Dr. Whitmore said. Then her expression grew serious. But I don't recommend trying that again. Charlotte has formed a profound attachment to Sabrina. Separating them could be genuinely traumatic. We're not separating again, Sabrina said firmly. Ever. Dr. Whitmore looked between them, taking in the engagement ring, the way they stood close together, the obvious intimacy. I see, she said quietly. And, Catherine, how are you handling the transition? The question was directed at Gareth, but Sabrina felt its weight too. They were building happiness on the foundation of another woman's loss. Catherine is gone, Gareth said simply. I loved her. I'll always love her. But she's gone. Charlotte deserves to grow up with a mother who's here, who's alive, who can love her and care for her. And you believe Sabrina can fill that role? I don't believe it, Gareth said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I know it. She already has. Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. Catherine would want Charlotte to be happy, she said finally. She'd want her to be loved and cared for and given every opportunity to thrive. If Sabrina can provide that, I can, Sabrina said quietly. I will. Then you have my blessing, Dr. Whitmore said, and Sabrina felt weight she didn't know she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. Both of you. After Dr. Whitmore left, Sabrina and Gareth spent the afternoon planning their wedding, discussing the foundation, and simply enjoying being together. Charlotte napped peacefully in her crib, waking only to eat before settling back into contented sleep. I have one more surprise, Gareth said as evening approached. Please tell me it's not another reporter, Sabrina said with a laugh. Better, he said, pulling out his phone. I've arranged dinner with the mayor tomorrow night, and the governor next week, and I've scheduled interviews with carefully selected journalists who actually care about the story behind the scandal. Gareth, we're going to control the narrative, he said firmly. We're going to tell our story on our terms. The real story about a baby who was dying, a nurse who saved her life, and two people who found love in tragedy. Sabrina felt tears prick her eyes. You don't have to expose yourself like that for me. I'm not doing it for you, he said, pulling her into his arms. I'm doing it for us, for our family, for the foundation we're going to build together. I'm done hiding from the truth. And what's the truth? She asked, looking up into his eyes. The truth is that I love you, he said simply. The truth is that you saved my daughter's life and mine. The truth is that we're going to get married and raise Charlotte together and build something beautiful out of something that started with so much pain. I love you too, she whispered, reaching up to kiss him. I love you and Charlotte and this crazy, complicated life we're building together. As the sun set over Connecticut, painting the sky in gold and pink, Sabrina realized that this was what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to fight for love despite obstacles. Not certainty of success, but commitment to try. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media attention, family drama, the complex process of blending their lives together. But tonight, they were home. They were together. They were a family, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Chapter 9. The Choice That Changes. Everything. The annual Connecticut Business Leaders Gala was the kind of event where fortunes were made and destroyed over champagne and carefully orchestrated small talk. But Gareth Hobson had never used it as a stage for his personal life until tonight. He stood at the podium of the Hartford Marriott's grand ballroom, 500 of the state's most powerful people hanging on his every word, and prepared to risk everything he'd built for the woman he loved. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying the confidence that had made him one of the most respected businessmen in New England. I came here tonight to talk about the future of American industry, but I find myself wanting to talk about something more personal, something more important. In the audience, Sabrina felt her pulse quicken. They'd discussed this moment, planned for it, but seeing Gareth step up to the microphone made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her. 3 months ago, my daughter Charlotte was dying, Gareth continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. She was failing to thrive, rejecting every form of nutrition we tried. The doctors told me to prepare for the worst. A murmur ran through the crowd. Many had heard rumors about Charlotte's health crisis, but Gareth had never spoken about it publicly. His personal life had always been fiercely protected. Then a remarkable woman named Sabrina Fisher came into our lives, he said, his eyes finding hers in the crowd. She didn't just save Charlotte's life, she saved mine. She reminded me what it means to fight for what matters most. Sabrina felt tears prick her eyes as she watched him lay his heart bare in front of everyone who mattered in their professional world. She was wearing the emerald green dress he'd bought her, Catherine's diamond necklace, and the engagement ring that caught the light with every movement. "I know many of you have read the stories about us," Gareth continued, his voice gaining strength. "You've seen the speculation, the rumors, the attempts to turn our love story into something shameful. But I'm here tonight to tell you the truth." Catherine Sinclair, seated near the back, went rigid in her chair. She'd been dreading this moment since learning about the engagement, hoping Gareth would come to his senses before making such a public spectacle. "The truth is that Sabrina Fisher is the most remarkable woman I've ever met," Gareth said, his voice carrying to every corner. "She's brilliant, compassionate, and brave enough to risk everything for a child who wasn't even hers. She's the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some faces showed surprise, others approval, and a few displayed the calculated interest that meant they were already planning how to use this information. "Which is why," Gareth continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I'm hoping she'll do me the honor of becoming my wife." He pulled out a small velvet box, and the crowd gasped as they realized what was happening. This wasn't just a speech. This was a proposal happening in front of 500 witnesses. "Sabrina Fisher," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Will you marry me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the world. Sabrina stood slowly, her heart pounding. This was the moment they'd talked about, the public declaration that would either cement their future or destroy everything they'd built. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her nerves. "Yes, I'll marry you." The applause was thunderous, but Sabrina barely heard it. She was walking toward the stage, toward Gareth, toward the future they were claiming together despite every obstacle. He met her at the bottom of the steps, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with passion that made it clear this wasn't a business arrangement. This was real, deep, transformative love. "I love you," he whispered against her lips, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "I love you too," she replied, not caring who heard. The crowd erupted again, but their moment was interrupted by the sound of a chair scraping. Catherine Sinclair was standing, her face white with fury, her hands shaking as she stared at the couple on stage. "This is obscene," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "My sister is barely cold in her grave, and you're parading your mistress around like some kind of trophy." The word mistress hit the crowd like a slap, and Sabrina felt every eye turn to stare at them. This was the moment they'd been preparing for, the inevitable confrontation that would either make or break their public acceptance. "Catherine," Gareth said, his voice calm but firm, "please don't do this here." "Where else am I supposed to do it?" Catherine shot back, her composure shattered. "You won't return my calls, you won't see me. You've shut me out completely so you can play house with your new family. Because you refuse to accept that Charlotte needs a mother who's alive," Gareth said, his voice carrying steel. "You refuse to accept that I have the right to find happiness again." "Happiness?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "You call this happiness? Replacing Catherine with some opportunistic nurse who saw a chance to upgrade her life?" "That's enough," Sabrina said, stepping forward. She'd been prepared for this moment, had rehearsed what she would say, but now found herself speaking from the heart. "I loved Catherine," she said, her voice carrying to every corner. "I never met her, but I loved her because she gave life to the most wonderful little girl in the world. I loved her because she loved Gareth, and that love made him the man I fell in love with." The crowd was completely silent, captivated by the raw emotion in her voice. "I'm not trying to replace Catherine," Sabrina continued. "I couldn't if I wanted to. But Charlotte needs a mother who's here, who's alive, who can love her and care for her and watch her grow up. And Gareth needs a partner who can stand beside him, not just the memory of someone who's gone. You don't understand, Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. You didn't know her. You didn't see how much she loved him, how much she wanted that baby. You're erasing her like she never existed. I'm not erasing anyone, Sabrina said gently. I talk to Charlotte about her mother every day. I tell her how much Catherine loved her, how she chose every detail of the nursery, how she would have been the most wonderful mother. Catherine's love for Charlotte isn't gone. It's being carried forward by people who care about her daughter's future. But you're taking her place, Catherine whispered. You're living in her house, wearing her jewelry, raising her baby. I'm not taking anything, Sabrina said, her voice firm but compassionate. I'm giving Charlotte the mother she needs, Gareth the partner he deserves, and Catherine's memory the honor of knowing her daughter is loved and cared for. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief and guilt and impossible choices. Finally, Catherine spoke again, her voice broken. She was my sister, she said. She was all I had left of our family. And now she's gone. And you're here. And it's like she never existed. She'll always exist, Gareth said, his voice gentle but firm. She'll exist in Charlotte's smile, in the way she laughs, in the love that created her. But Catherine is gone, Catherine, and the living have to find a way to keep living. Even if it means forgetting her. We're not forgetting her, Sabrina said. We're honoring her by making sure her daughter grows up happy and loved and secure. We're honoring her by building a family that she would be proud of. Catherine stared at them for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions, grief, anger, acceptance, and finally, reluctant understanding. Catherine would want Charlotte to be happy, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd want her to be loved. Yes, Sabrina said softly, she would. And she'd want Gareth to find peace, Catherine continued, working through the logic aloud. She'd want him to move forward, not spend the rest of his life mourning. She would, Gareth confirmed. You know she would. Catherine nodded slowly, and for the first time since Catherine's death, Sabrina saw a glimpse of the woman she must have been before grief consumed her. I'm sorry, Catherine said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I've been so angry, so lost, and I took it out on you, both of you. You don't have to apologize, Sabrina said. You loved Catherine. You're grieving. That's natural. But I can't let my grief hurt Charlotte, Catherine said, her voice gaining strength. And I can't let it hurt you. Catherine wouldn't want that. She walked toward the stage, her steps slow but determined. When she reached them, she looked directly at Sabrina. Can you forgive me, she asked, for the things I said, the pain I caused? There's nothing to forgive, Sabrina said, reaching out to take Catherine's hands. You were protecting your sister's memory. I understand that. Will you let me be part of Charlotte's life? Catherine asked. I know I don't deserve it after how I've acted, but she's all I have left of Catherine. You're Charlotte's aunt, Sabrina said firmly. You'll always be part of her life. She needs to know about her mother, and you're the person who can tell her those stories. Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, for saving her life, for loving her, for giving her the family she deserves. The crowd, which had been watching this intensely personal drama unfold, suddenly erupted in applause. Not the polite, calculated applause of a business function, but the genuine, emotional response of people who just witnessed something profound. Ladies and gentlemen, Gareth said, returning to the microphone, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Sabrina Fisher, and my daughter's aunt, Catherine Sinclair. Together, we're going to make sure Charlotte Hobson grows up knowing she's loved by an entire extended family. The applause was thunderous, but Sabrina barely heard it. She was looking at Catherine, seeing the woman's pain and courage, and realizing they were going to be able to build something beautiful together. "There's one more thing," Gareth said, and the crowd quieted again. "Sabrina and I are starting a foundation in Catherine's memory. The Catherine Hobson Foundation for Maternal and Infant Health will work to ensure that no family has to face the kind of crisis we went through." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause, but Sabrina was focused on Catherine's face. The older woman was smiling through her tears, and Sabrina knew they'd found a way to honor Catherine's memory while building their own future. "When's the wedding?" someone called out from the crowd. "Next month," Gareth replied, pulling Sabrina closer. "We don't want to wait any longer to start our life together." "And the foundation?" another voice asked. "Will be operational within 6 months, Sabrina said, finding her voice. "We want to help families immediately, not make them wait while we navigate bureaucracy." As they finally made their way off the stage, Catherine at their side, Sabrina felt a sense of completion settle over her. They weren't just building a marriage or a family. They were building a legacy. One that would honor Catherine's memory while creating something new and beautiful for Charlotte's future. The photographers were waiting outside, their cameras flashing as the unlikely trio emerged together. But instead of running from the attention, they walked straight toward it, hand in hand, ready to tell their story on their own terms. The headlines tomorrow would be different, not scandal and speculation, but love and healing and the power of second chances. Tonight, they'd chosen each other. And in the end, that was the only choice that mattered. Chapter 10. Hearts Bound Forever. The morning of her wedding day, Sabrina woke up in the master bedroom she now shared with Gareth, sunlight streaming through the windows as Charlotte's laughter echoed from the garden below, where she was helping Eleanor with final preparations. In 4 hours, she would walk down the aisle of the estate's garden chapel and officially become Mrs. Gareth Hobson. But first, she had something important to do. She found Charlotte in her big girl room, sitting on the window seat in her flower girl dress, pale pink silk that made her look like a princess, while Catherine braided tiny white roses into her dark hair. "Mommy Sabrina!" Charlotte called out, bouncing excitedly. "Do you like my dress? Aunt Catherine said I look beautiful." "You look like the most beautiful princess in the whole world," Sabrina said, kneeling to Charlotte's level. At 2.5, Charlotte was a chattering, energetic little girl who filled the mansion with laughter and chaos in equal measure. "I have something special for you," Sabrina said, pulling out a small velvet box. "Something that belonged to your first mommy." Charlotte's eyes widened with interest. She'd grown up hearing stories about Catherine, looking at pictures, understanding that she'd had 2 mothers, one who'd loved her so much she died bringing her into the world, and one who loved her enough to never let her forget the first one. "What is it?" Charlotte asked, reaching for the box with careful fingers. Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with Catherine's initials, containing a tiny photo of Catherine holding newborn Charlotte in their brief moments together. "This was your first mommy's," Sabrina explained, fastening the locket around Charlotte's neck. "She wore it when she was little, and her mummy gave it to her. Now it's yours." Charlotte touched the locket reverently, her small fingers tracing the engraved letters. "Will you tell me about her again?" "Of course," Sabrina said, settling beside her on the window seat. "Your first mommy had the most beautiful smile, and she loved your daddy so much. She picked out all the colors in this room because she wanted everything to be perfect for you." "And she's watching from heaven?" Charlotte asked, the question she'd asked countless times before. "She's watching from heaven," Sabrina confirmed, "and she's so happy that you're loved and safe and growing up strong." "Will you be my mommy forever?" Charlotte asked, The question she'd started asking recently, needing constant reassurance that this happiness was permanent. Forever and always, Sabrina said, kissing the top of Charlotte's head. Nothing in the whole world could make me stop being your mummy. Good, Charlotte said with satisfaction, because I love you the most in the whole world. I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the stars in the sky. Catherine watched this exchange with tears in her eyes, marveling at how naturally Sabrina had stepped into motherhood while never trying to erase Catherine's memory. The foundation they'd established in Catherine's name had already helped dozens of families navigate medical crises with their children. The wedding ceremony was held in the estate's rose garden, transformed into a fairy tale setting with white silk ribbons, thousands of flowers, and an arch where Gareth waited in his black tuxedo, looking more handsome than any man had a right to look. Sabrina walked down the aisle in her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit perfectly, carrying white roses and baby's breath. Her parents beamed from the front row, still adjusting to their daughter's transformation from struggling nurse to philanthropist and society wife. Charlotte preceded her down the aisle, scattering rose petals with serious concentration, stopping halfway to wave at her father and call out, "Daddy, I'm being the best flower girl ever." "You're perfect, sweetheart," Gareth called back, his voice thick with emotion. The ceremony was officiated by the minister who'd baptized Charlotte, and the vows they exchanged were their own words, speaking of love that had survived scandal, family built on choice rather than blood, and promises to honor both past and future. "I promise to love Charlotte as my own daughter," Sabrina said, her voice clear and strong, "to honor Catherine's memory by giving her child the best possible life, and to stand beside you through whatever challenges come our way." "I promise to love you with my whole heart," Gareth replied, "to be worthy of the sacrifice you made for our family, and to spend every day making you happy. You chose us." When they kissed to seal their marriage, Charlotte clapped enthusiastically and announced to the assembled guests, "Now my mommy and daddy are married forever." The reception was held in the mansion's ballroom, but the real celebration happened later, after the guests had gone home and the three of them were alone in Charlotte's room for bedtime stories. "Tell me about the wedding," Charlotte demanded, even though she'd been there for every moment. "Tell me about how you married Daddy." "Well," Sabrina said, settling into the rocking chair where she'd first nursed a dying baby 2.5 years ago, "there was a beautiful princess who wore a pink dress and scattered flower petals." "That's me," Charlotte interrupted with delight. "That's you," Sabrina confirmed. "And there was a prince who was so handsome and so kind. That's Daddy. That's Daddy. And there was a lady who loved them both so much that she promised to take care of them forever and always." "That's you, Mommy Sabrina." "That's me," Sabrina said, her heart overflowing with contentment. "And they all lived happily ever after." "Will we really live happily ever after?" Charlotte asked, her blue eyes serious in the way only children's could be. "We'll live happily right now," Sabrina said, which was the only honest answer she could give, "and we'll work every day to keep being happy together." "Good," Charlotte said, settling back against her pillows. "I like being happy." After Charlotte fell asleep, Sabrina and Gareth walked through the mansion that had become their home, past portraits of Hobson ancestors, past rooms where Catherine's presence was still felt but no longer hurt, to the master bedroom where they would spend their first night as husband and wife. "Any regrets?" Gareth asked, pulling her into his arms. "Only that it took us so long to get here," Sabrina said, reaching up to kiss him. "Only that we wasted so much time being afraid." "Not wasted," Gareth said. "We needed that time to heal, to grow, to become the people who were ready for this." "And are we ready?" "We're ready," he said with absolute certainty. "We're ready for whatever comes next." Outside their window, the Connecticut estate stretched out in moonlight, peaceful and secure. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. Not Charlotte, who was sleeping peacefully, but perhaps a child whose parents might someday benefit from the foundation they'd built in Catherine's memory. Sabrina thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the desperate night when she'd first nursed a dying baby, through the scandal that had almost destroyed them, to this moment of perfect happiness. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment of pain and uncertainty. "I love you," she whispered against Gareth's lips. "I love you too," he replied, "forever and always." Epilogue. 3 years later. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the Hobson mansion as 5-year-old Charlotte raced down the marble hallway, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Mommy! Daddy! I'm home!" she called out, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had important news to share. She found them in Gareth's study, where Sabrina was reviewing applications for the Foundation's new scholarship program while Gareth worked on quarterly reports. The sight of them together still filled Charlotte with the security of knowing her parents loved each other as much as they loved her. "How was school, sweetheart?" Sabrina asked, setting aside her papers to give Charlotte her full attention. "Amazing," Charlotte announced, climbing onto Sabrina's lap with casual confidence. "Mrs. Peterson said I'm the best reader in the whole class, and we learned about families today." "What did you learn about families?" Gareth asked, looking up from his computer. "That families come in all different shapes and sizes," Charlotte recited dutifully, "and that the most important thing is that people love each other and take care of each other." "That's right," Sabrina said, smoothing Charlotte's dark hair. "What else did you learn?" "I learned that some kids have one mommy and one daddy, and some kids have two mommies or two daddies, and some kids live with their grandparents, and some kids are adopted." Charlotte paused, her expression growing thoughtful. "And I learned that I'm extra special because I had two mommies who both loved me so much." Sabrina felt emotion well up in her eyes. "You are extra special," she said. "You're the most special little girl in the whole world." "I told Mrs. Peterson about my first mommy, Catherine, who's in heaven, and about you who takes care of me every day," Charlotte continued, "and she said that makes me twice as loved as most kids." "Twice as loved," Gareth repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly right." "And I told her about our foundation that helps other kids like me," Charlotte added proudly. "She said I should be proud of what my family does." "We're proud of what our family does," Sabrina said, hugging Charlotte closer. "And we're proud of you for understanding how important it is to help other people." "Will I get to work at the foundation when I grow up?" Charlotte asked, the question she'd been asking more frequently lately. "You can do whatever makes you happy," Gareth said, "whether that's working at the foundation or being a doctor or an artist or anything else you want to be." "I want to help babies like me," Charlotte said, with the certainty of a child who'd found her calling early. "I want to help kids who need extra love." "Then that's what you'll do," Sabrina said, kissing the top of Charlotte's head. "And we'll be right there beside you, cheering you on." "Forever and always?" Charlotte asked, the question that had become their family's motto. "Forever and always," both parents replied in unison. Later that evening, after Charlotte had gone to bed, Sabrina and Gareth sat in the former nursery, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the bed that had replaced the crib where their love story began. "She's going to change the world," Sabrina said softly. "She already has," Gareth replied, pulling his wife closer. "She changed ours." "Do you think Catherine would be proud?" Sabrina asked, a question she still posed sometimes, needing the reassurance that they'd honored the woman who'd made their family possible. "I think Catherine would be amazed by the woman her daughter is becoming," Gareth said, and I think she'd be grateful that Charlotte grew up knowing she was loved by so many people. Even me. Especially you, Gareth said firmly. You didn't just save Charlotte's life, Sabrina. You gave her the mother she needed, the security she deserved, and the love that will carry her through whatever challenges she faces. We all saved each other, Sabrina said, the truth she'd come to understand over the years. We all gave each other what we needed most. And we're still doing it, Gareth said. Every day, we're still choosing each other, still choosing this family, still choosing love. Forever and always, Sabrina said, the promise that had become their truth. Forever and always, Gareth agreed. And in the big girl bed, surrounded by pictures of both her mothers, Charlotte slept peacefully, dreaming of the future she would build on the foundation of love they'd created together. A future where every child would know the security she'd found, where every family would have the support they'd given each other, where love would always be stronger than loss. The Hobson family had found their happily ever after, not in the absence of challenges, but in the presence of unconditional love, unwavering commitment, and the courage to choose each other every single day. It was a love story worth telling, a family worth celebrating, and a future worth building together. Forever and always. The end.